Well, thank you all very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Christina, I'm particularly pleased to share so many awards with your dad. He has the National Medal of Technology. He's had the Turing Award and this one a couple of years ago, so it's a real honor to be associated with Doug and all of his accomplishments too. In theory, I should be able to convince this machine to bring up some slides. Let's see whether I'm capable of making that happen. That looks good. And I'd like to make a couple of observations before I launch into my prepared remarks. One of them has to do with a question that was asked in the earlier session about net neutrality. I neglected to point out that there are companies, I won't name them, that are interested in somehow inhibiting a certain amount of competition for the provision of internet services. And some of them have been turning to state legislatures as a way of inhibiting others from competing. And I understand that a situation of that sort occurred here in Wisconsin with WiskNet. I consider this to be sort of an egregious violation of trust because universities are, in fact, the place where a great deal of our new technology comes from, and it's because they create infrastructure and make it available that we can monetize and commercialize many of the new applications that we all enjoy. So I consider it to be a terrible injustice for any corporation to try to inhibit competition by means of this sort of legislation. In fact, if anything, we need legislation that encourages and protects competitive provision of service. So I thought that I would pick a theme today about the Internet of Things, and in a funny way, it's an odd contrast to the earlier remarks that focus so much on the human aspect of networking and communication. Certainly, Internet plays an important role in that, in facilitating that communication, but I think we're going to see another rather interesting phenomenon emerging out of this Internet of devices that we can see coming. This is what the Internet looked like 10 years ago, and of course it looks about this way today. This was generated automatically by looking at the global routing tables of the Internet and coloring each autonomous system differently. Now, there are literally hundreds of thousands of networks that make up the Internet. They're all independently operated. You have a little Internet at home, and you run it, and you make decisions about what equipment to buy and what software to configure. The same is true of the larger Internet service provider systems, that is to say, larger than your home network. The Internet service providers vary in their size as well, and they make their own decisions about with whom to interconnect, when to make investments in additional capacity or new capabilities, what software and brand of equipment to run, and they all decide whether they're going to interconnect with each other and when and how and under what conditions. So this is a gigantic collaboration. No one is forced to be part of the network. It's simply something you decide to do because being on is somehow better than not being on. So we've seen this system grow exactly the way Bob and I had hoped. We released the design of the network publicly. We made no intellectual property claims about it. We said, if you follow these rules and implement things that work the way the rules say, you should be able to interconnect and interoperate successfully. We won't say who should interoperate with whom. We just give you the rules that will allow you to interwork if you follow them. And of course, this is what you see happening. People build pieces of Internet for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are not-for-profit, some are for-profit, some are in the academic community, some are government-operated, some are private sector. So there are many different motivations for becoming a part of this very colorful and rapidly expanding picture. There are over 800 million publicly visible computers on the Internet, but that's not the whole story. There are lots and lots of computers that are part of the Internet because they're behind firewalls in the enterprise community, and they're being protected from external visibility and potentially protected from external attack. There are nearly 2 billion users, but as the chief internet evangelist, I'm sitting here saying, wait a minute, there's 6.7 billion people in the world. I have 4.7 billion people to convert. So I have a lot of work ahead of me, and I'm looking at people like you to help make that happen. The other statistic, which you heard earlier, of course, is there are 5 billion mobiles in the world, and some significant fraction of them, maybe 15 to 20% today, are internet-enabled. More and more of them will be over time. And for many people in the world, their first and possibly only interaction with the internet will be through a mobile device. So anyone who is not paying attention to that may be missing an important part of their marketplace. Here are where the people are. And if I were giving this talk 10 years ago, the picture would have been quite different. North America was clearly the largest absolute number of users, or represented the largest absolute number of users for quite a long time, given that the internet began and grew in the United States. But now, as you see, Asia, even with a penetration rate of only 21% into its population, represents the single largest grouping of users, regional grouping of users, and of those 825 million in Asia, half of them are in mainland China. So for all of the noise that we hear about Chinese interfering with the network and blocking and or otherwise preventing people from using the system, what's really quite astonishing is that they're also investing very heavily in the use of that network. Europe is the next largest grouping, but I've given up making any projections about Europe because they keep adding countries, so the definition of Europe keeps changing. The rest of the area, you can see, Africa is an interesting situation. There's quite a varied economic situation across the 55 countries in Africa. There are about 1 billion people living there. The 110 million that are estimated users of the internet probably does not include those who are getting access through mobile phones, and now the estimate is some 200 to 300 million mobile phones in Africa. So the absolute number of users of the net is probably larger than this, but it still represents a modest penetration compared to some other parts of the world. So let me now turn to this Internet of Things idea. For many years, I've been watching devices show up on the network that were not computers, things like refrigerators and picture frames. I remember the first time an internet-enabled picture frame showed up, someone ran into my office and said, Vint, did you see the internet-enabled picture frame? And I remember thinking that sounds about as useful as an electric fork, you know. But until I realized how this thing worked. I mean, it has a little operating system in it, and it has memory, and it can go out on the net, pull images off of a web server, and then cycle through them and put up captions if you want. So it's actually a fairly useful kind of tool. We use them around the house quite a bit now. There's the telephones that look like telephones, but they're really Cisco or other voice over IP boxes. There's internet-enabled refrigerators, and I'll come back to that. There's even an internet-enabled light bulb. I used to tell jokes about, you know, someday light bulbs will have internet addresses. Well, there now are light bulbs that are made. They're LED light bulbs. They're fairly expensive, which means that the percentage of cost to make it internet-enabled is fairly small. It's 50 cents to $1 to put IPv6 into this thing. So now we got internet-enabled light bulbs, and I can't make jokes about it anymore. The fellow in the middle is the one I really am fascinated by. He's a Dutchman who built an internet-enabled surfboard. And haven't met him, but I'm imagining he's sitting on the water waiting for the next wave, and he's thinking, you know, if I had a laptop and my surfboard, I could be surfing the internet while I'm waiting to. So he put the laptop and the surfboard and a Wi-Fi service at the Rescue Shack, and now he has a product which he sells to people who want to do both things at the same time. So I want to make a couple of points here about the internet, and it's specifically with regard to the focus of attention that you have on new media. I hope everyone already knows this, but I'll emphasize it anyway. The internet protocol is a very odd duck. First of all, the packets that make up the internet, they're sort of like little postcards. I mean, they have a from address, to address, they have some content. Those postcards on the internet have absolutely no clue how they're being carried. We were very careful in the internet protocol design to say nothing about the underlying transmission technology that was used to move packets from one place to another. The consequence of that very conscious decision is that every time a new technology came along for transporting digital information, internet packets could ride on top. And so we've been able to sweep into the internet's ambit all new communication technologies that have come along. The second interesting thing is that the packets don't know what they're carrying. All they know is they have a bag of bits that they're supposed to move from point A to point B with some probability greater than 0. That's all they know. The fact that they don't know what they're carrying means that when you want to add a new application to the internet, you don't have to change the internet. You just have to change the software at the edges of the net that interpret the bits of the packets. So the consequence of that has been what I will call permissionless innovation. People simply can go out and try out new applications on the internet without getting permission from every ISP in the world or without having to get the internet to change. Now, it's not true that the internet is completely unchanging, and in fact, those of you who have been following will know that we have exhausted the IP version 4 address space. In February of this year, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority had allocated all of its last available IP version 4 address space to the regional internet registries, which in turn supply address space to the internet service providers. Well, the decision to use a 32-bit address was made in 1973, when Bob Kahn and I thought this was an experiment. We didn't know if it was going to work. This was re-examined in 1977, just as we were about to standardize the internet protocols. And there were debates over whether we should have a 128-bit address or a 32-bit address or a variable length address. The programmers all rejected variable length addressing. They said we'd waste computer cycles trying to find the fields in the packets because of the variable length address, so that went away. And I did the math on a 128-bit address structure, 340 trillion addresses. That didn't pass the red face test, right? We'd only just done a 3-network test of the internet in 1977. And I couldn't imagine standing up in front of anybody saying, okay, we've got this 3-network test done. Now I need 340 trillion addresses to do the rest of the experiment. So I thought 4.3 billion ought to be a reasonable number. It's 32 bits. So that's what we picked. And of course, the problem is the experiment never ended. So here we are. In 2011, we're still using the experimental internet. It's time to build the production version. So on June 8th of this year, many of us, several hundred companies around the world, turned on IPv6 addressing and tested it. It was the World IPv6 Day, and I'm very happy to say that the network didn't collapse, nothing broke. The network isn't going to collapse when we run out of v4 addresses. It simply can't grow. So the purpose here is to get v6 addresses into the system as well as IPv4 in parallel. And by the way, what's very important about this is that we have to make both v4 and v6 run at the same time in the network and in devices. Some people kind of imagine, well, I can be a v4 device or I can be a v6 device and I don't need to do both at the same time. Not true. Depending on where your device happens to be, if it's portable, it might be in a place where only v4 is available. It might be in a place where only v6 is available, or it might be in a place where both are available. And if it can get to both, it may want to use both because there may be places in the net that aren't yet converted to v6 and it still needs to speak v4. So we literally have devices that have to run both at the same time. And that's called dual stack operation, and that's the preferred mode until we get to the point where everybody can do v6, and then we don't have to be so dependent on v4 anymore. There are lots and lots of ways in which the internet is vulnerable, and I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that there is work going on to improve the resistance of the internet to various forms of attack. One of them is the domain name system, which maps domain names into IP addresses. Those entries in the domain name system are now being digitally signed using public key cryptography. ICANN and VeriSign, working together, digitally sign the root zone, which points to all the top-level domains. And many of the top-level domains now digitally sign their zone files and so on down the hierarchy. So that's an important introduction. The routing system has similar vulnerabilities, and the use of digital signatures has been proposed, although not yet implemented, in order to inhibit people from announcing the use of address space to which they have not been given the authority to announce. There are other things that are going on, the addition of sensor networks, the Smart Grid program, which the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce announced about a year and a half ago. This is a major effort to make electrical appliances smarter about their use of electrical power and their ability to be told, by the way, we're in a peak load right now, and if you're heating water, maybe you should delay heating the water until we get past that peak load. That's a smart use of electrical power, and we're seeing an opportunity now to make equipment that will respond that way. And finally, of course, we're all carrying mobile devices, which are becoming such an important part of the internet. So now I'd like to switch over to talk a bit more about applications in the network. And one of them is sensor nets. I have in my house a commercially available IP version 6 radio-based sensor network. Every 5 minutes, it's collecting temperature, humidity, and light level information in every room in the house, and it reports that to a server that's down in the basement. And then twice a day, I get a summary report from that server about the conditions that it sees in the system. So what you're seeing here is a little chart of how the connectivity works. Since these are radio-based devices, they're running Linux, each one of them. This is a small little device running on AA batteries, and it's running not only Linux and the sensor system, but it's doing store and forward networking. So it's actually calculating connectivity in real time, compensating for various changes in connectivity because of radio interference. So this is quite a dynamic little network that's running in the house. This is an example of the kind of report that I get back. There's actually substantially more detail than this. This is just the quick top-level summary saying that the sensor is alive and running. Here's when the report was sent. You can see in the top line, if you can read it, it says 2.69 V low. That says that the 3-volt battery, the 2 AA batteries, are now delivering only 2.69 volts, and that's considered to be low, and you should go replace the battery. I've actually let it run all the way down to about 2.4 volts, and it runs until then, and then it craps out. It was 76 degrees Fahrenheit at the time that this bedroom 2 sample was made, 47% humidity, and the lights are out. It's not too surprising at 7 in the morning in a bedroom that isn't occupied. Now let's drill down a little bit. Here's a closer view of some of the information. You'll notice that the last line says wine cellar is alive, and this is a very important room in the house. It has a couple of thousand bottles of wine in it, and it has to stay below 60 degrees to keep the wine, in proper condition. It also has to stay above 40% humidity, maybe even preferably above 50 or 60% to keep the corks from drying out. So if that particular sensor discovers that we've exceeded 60 degrees, it's alarmed, and I get an SMS on my mobile that tells me that your wine is warming up. So when I went to the Argonne National Laboratory last year for a 3-day visit, just as I was walking into the building, my mobile went off. It was the wine cellar calling, and it said, you've just broken through the 60-degree barrier. And unfortunately, my wife was away on a trip for 2 weeks, so every 5 minutes for the next 3 days, I kept getting a message saying, your wine is warming up. By the time I got home, it was 70 degrees in the wine cellar, which is not the end of the world, but it wasn't good. So I called the Archrock people who make this equipment, and I said, do you make remote sensors or actuators? Do you make remote actuators? They said, yes. So I said, good, that's a weekend project. I'll install a remote actuator so that I can turn on the cooling system if it happens to fail to operate. That had better be strongly authenticated control, though, because I don't want the 15-year-old next door to reprogram my house while I'm away. So this is going to be very common. I mean, this sounds very geeky, but the whole point here was to gather enough data so at the end of the year I'd be able to say something to the people who are adjusting the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning about what the real engineering data is for how well or poorly it had distributed heating and cooling. But I think that this will be very commonplace because we want to be more efficient about our use of energy, and the only way we can do that is to get real data about how well things are working. So I want you to imagine for a moment that an increasing number of devices, common devices that you find around the house, are internet enabled. Once they become capable of interacting with other things on the internet, this creates a universe of devices that can be managed remotely. They can report their conditions. It creates a sort of a virtual space of real objects. So the virtual representations of the objects are the things that we interact with. And it allows third parties to create new applications and services. So An obvious application is to manage your entertainment. Now, we probably all have at home some kind of entertainment system. Typically involves more than one device. Typically those devices have remote controllers, and if you're like me, you fumble around trying to figure out which remote controller I should use for a particular device. And after I figure that out, that's the remote controller with the dead battery. So my proposition is to get rid of all the remote controllers, use my mobile, which is connected to the local net in the house, 802.11 for example, and either directly interact through the net with those entertainment devices, or possibly invoke a third party who has access to those devices. So a third party could say, well, if you will give me access to the devices around the house, I will help you organize your movies and videos or music and so on. I'll store things on the iPod, I'll put things into the car, I'll put things into the DVR for video entertainment. You can easily imagine companies offering a rich variety of different products and services. I use the Fios system at home from Verizon to get access to the internet and for video content. And they have third-party controllers or remote controllers that you can log into on the net and then interact through them with the devices in the house. So this is a worked example of what happens when you internet enable some of these things. You could easily see household security devices becoming a part of this sort of architecture, or the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, which is something I've chosen to instrument. You can imagine webcams being in office buildings, and you can imagine the security forces, the police department, approaching a building whose alarm has gone off and using properly authorized access control, getting access to the webcams inside the building in order to see what might be there before you actually go in. There are a variety of things, scenarios that you could think of along those lines. You'll notice that access control and authority here is really important. Identity is important, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. Another example of how 911 can become much more powerful than it is today. When you dial 911 today, the origin telephone number is used to look up in a database to figure out where that telephone number physically is. Well, if it's a wired, hardwired telephone, that's not an unreasonable thing. You get the address of a building. If you're in a mobile, of course, that's a different question, and then you have to decide, well, how much does the mobile know about where it is? You might estimate where it is based on knowing which cell towers it's able to reach. You might actually have a good GPS signal, but if you're inside of a building, GPS generally doesn't work. But you can imagine going into, let's say, a hotel, and walking into your hotel room and having the hotel room tell your device where it is. You're at this address in this room. Just like you go in to get connected to the Wi-Fi service of the hotel, when it gives you an IP address and tells you the domain name system, the nearest router and so on, it could also be telling you this other information. And when you ask for emergency service, your device takes that information and supplies it to the emergency services. So this is a much more refined kind of 911. And if you wanted to step farther in that direction, you can imagine putting more personal information into the device, which you choose to share with emergency services so that they know that you're a diabetic or they know that your blood type is something. There's a variety of extended possibilities that this sort of online device can create. And this is the kind of thinking that I would like to stimulate. Another example, this is Google Earth, but you can imagine having the ability to create a layer of Google Earth that you could zoom into about where's my stuff. So if you have lost your luggage, for example, it might be nice to know, did it end up in Timbuktu while you were on your way to London? So the idea of being able to instrument things that normally are not part of the network at all, like a suitcase, is not entirely crazy. And I think I have an example. Yes, I have an example here on RFID chips. So let me go back to the devices that could be on the net. What about an internet-enabled refrigerator? There are some high-end refrigerators that have a nice liquid crystal touch-sensitive display. Your refrigerator is available, in America we often use refrigerators for family communication. except it's pieces of paper and magnets that cover the front of the refrigerator. Now we can augment that with blogging and email and tweeting and so on. Another interesting possibility is that if we had, well, actually, let's see, there's an interesting extension of this. Suppose that we had the ability to know what was inside the refrigerator. Maybe everything that's in there has an RFID chip or a uniform product code. Then the refrigerator could be surfing the net while you're out working, trying to figure out what recipes it could make with what it has inside. And so when you come home, you might see a nice list of recipes that you could have for dinner. Or maybe, you know, you're out shopping and the refrigerator sends you a tweet saying, don't forget the marinara sauce, I have everything else I need for spaghetti dinner tonight. Now, I'm sorry to say that our Japanese inventors have done us a disservice. They've invented an internet-enabled bathroom scale. And, you know, when you step on the scale, it figures out which family member you are based on your weight, and it sends that information to the doctor, and it becomes part of your medical record. And that's probably okay, except that the refrigerator is on the same network. And so when you come home, you see diet recipes coming up on the display, or maybe it just refuses to open. I mean, this is a terrible thing. So I remember thinking, well, how far can we push these ideas? And what if I had internet-enabled socks? You know, you can sort of imagine that when you're missing one of the socks, you send sort of a multicast around the house to try to find the sock, and you get a report back saying, hi, this is sock number 144L. I'm under the sofa in the living room. So now we've solved the problem with the missing sock. But if you're, you know, a thoughtful engineer, you start thinking about other scenarios that might occur. Imagine that all of your clothes were internet-enabled, and you decide after working hard at the university that you're going to go down to the bar, but you call and you say, hi, honey, I'm working late at the lab. And she says, well, that's very interesting, dear, but your shirt seems to be down at 19th Street at the bar. So maybe internet-enabled clothing is a really bad idea, and we shouldn't do that. But the idea of using RFID chips to find things, the same sort of thing that you use when you go through the toll road to avoid having to put money into a till, is very appealing, especially if we could carry around our own RFID sensor system. Now, I'm not sure that the power drain might not be suitable for batteries, but let's pretend for a moment. Then the system could be constantly checking to see whether the things you don't want to lose are still within range, you know, like your briefcase or your laptop or something like that. And as soon as it can't sense it anymore, it's an alarm. It says, wait a minute, you forgot your X, and you can say, where's my stuff? And you might be able to retrieve things that you would have left behind because the system was constantly reminding itself that you shouldn't walk away with leaving your car keys behind or your glasses or your notebooks and things like that. So this idea of having RFID detection could be very attractive. Now, because you're focused on new media, I wanted to talk a little bit about IP television. And I'm not talking about streaming television. I'm not talking about the kind of thing that we do with YouTube, for example. Here I'm thinking about a much more elaborate possibility. Let's imagine, for the sake of discussion, that we are able to configure the stream of packets that are coming to a display device in such a way that they carry not only video and audio, but they carry other information. They might carry captions, for example. Okay, well, there's nothing new there. Caption TV been around since 1979. But you could also carry other digitizable information. You could be carrying advertisements. You could be carrying books. You could be carrying stories about the movie that you're watching or histories and biographies. You could be carrying software, maybe a game that's associated with the movie. There are literally anything you could digitize could be part of the packet stream that's coming into the device that's rendering this movie. If we were able to do this well, we might actually be able to make the objects in the field of view sensible. That is to say, if you could point to something, maybe it's a remote mouse, maybe you just go up and touch the screen. Maybe let's suppose that in the field of view there's a Macintosh that's on display. Maybe it's been put there as product placement. But because of the way the video has been composed, the system knows that that particular part of the screen is sensitive, and if you touch it, a window opens up and it says, "Oh, I see that you're interested in the Macintosh. That's a MacBook Pro. Oh, I see you're online right now. There's a Apple store down the street 6 blocks from here, and they have 5 of these in inventory. Would you like to buy one? Click here." Now, what's just happened is that you've taken product placement and you've turned it into an interactive experience. You've already figured out that the customer is interested in that particular device because they touched it in order to express interest in it. Now, I don't know whether this is really feasible, and haven't just revealed a new Google product because, as far as I know, we're not doing this. But this is the kind of thinking I would like to suggest, because I want people to find themselves able to interact more with these technologies that exist in digital form. This is such a rich infrastructure that we should take advantage of that for people to do things as opposed to simply passively observing that medium. So I'm quite excited about that. I mentioned earlier the internet-enabled picture frames. This gives me an opportunity to remind you about how important it is to be able to strongly authenticate parties so as to know whether they should have authorized access. If you know how those picture frames work, they typically go out to a website, download images, and then play them repeatedly. Now, if someone hacks the website that the picture frame is downloading, the grandparents may see pictures of what they hope are not the grandchildren. So this is a moment where you really want to make sure that the access control is very strong. This is a generally important notion in the internet environment today. It's very easy to use the internet in what you might think is an anonymous way. Now, let me set aside all the tracking issues and everything else for just a moment. It is true that you can't really tell where email came from because there are no standards at the moment for defining strongly authenticated sources. But there are technologies that will allow people to strongly authenticate themselves. And before you react too badly to the notion of strong user identification, let me separate 2 concepts. One is identifiers, and the other is identity. Those are not the same thing. You can imagine generating a completely random identifier and asserting to someone, I have a public and private key pair associated with that identifier, and I can prove it to you, because if you send me something encrypted in the public key that I've advertised to you, I can decrypt that and send it back to you to prove that I have the combination. It doesn't tell you anything about who I am. What it does do, though, is let you strongly assert that I'm the same person that showed up before. And that may be enough to carry on a perfectly useful transaction until such time as you say to the other party, hi, I'd like to borrow $50,000. At this point, the other side may say, I'd like to know a little more about you. Do you have a job? Do you have any assets? Do you have any collateral? And you might respond, with a summary of what your employment status is and so on. Of course, this party doesn't necessarily have to believe what you said. They know that somebody said it. It's the same party they've been interacting with because we're using these strongly authenticated identifiers. But you might also have gone to a third party, maybe it's a bank, and presented your bona fides, your birth certificate, driver's license, passport, and so on, and said, this identifier is to be associated with this identity, and here are my documents to prove it. The third party, the one you asked money from, could go to the bank, if you say that's the bank to go to, and you can verify that this identifier is associated with this identity and it has these properties. You work here, you have these assets, and so on. So the reason I'm going into all this detail is that I want you to recognize that we have strong technologies for making it possible for people to say, I'm the same person even if you don't know who I am. And we have the ability separately and independently to say, not only am I the same person, but I am this person in particular. And the reason that's important is that I want to preserve anonymity in the internet. It's important that people be able to do things anonymously, but at the same time, I want you and me to have the ability to say, I demand strong identity. I insist that you tell me who you are. You have the privilege of saying, I won't tell you. And of course, then I have the privilege of saying this conversation is over. But the whole point is that we want both of these capabilities to be strongly supported in the internet environment. So I want to finish with a little quick summary on the interplanetary internet. Every time I put this slide up, of course, people figure that I've gone crazy, I'm over the, you're nuts or something. The real answer is that about 1997 or 98 or so, I got to thinking, let's see, we started working on the internet in 1973. It's now 25 years later. What should we be working on now, that is to say in 1998, that will be needed 25 years from now? And one answer was a network that would work across the solar system in order to support manned and robotic space exploration. So I got together with people at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and we began talking about what we were seeing happening. In 1998 on Mars, we had just successfully landed the Pathfinder, this small little rover that went around for quite a while, showing some wonderful photographs of Mars. And we thought, well, what else is planned in the future? And one of the things that was planned are the two rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, which landed in 2004, and were originally scheduled for a 90-day period. And so this, remember now, by this time, 2004, we are working on this interplanetary internet design since 1998. When the rovers landed on Mars, the original plan was that they would transmit data directly back to Earth to the Deep Space Network with big 70-meter dishes located at 3 places around the globe, one in Canberra, Australia, one in Goldstone, California, and one in Madrid, Spain. Well, it turned out that the radio that was to be used to transmit directly from the surface of Mars back to Earth overheated. And of course, they immediately shut this down and had to reduce the duty cycle to keep the radio from damaging itself. Well, the scientists were pretty upset because the direct-to-Earth path was only capable of delivering 28 kilobits a second in the first place. And now we have to reduce the duty cycle in order to keep the equipment from being damaged. So now they're getting less data back than they originally planned on, and they weren't very happy about that in the first place. So now they're really unhappy. So the engineers at the Jet Propulsion Lab said, well, we have orbiters around Mars which were originally used to map the surface of Mars to figure out where the rover should go, but they finished that task. They're still in orbit. They still have solar power, they still have computing and memory, and they still have communications. And we have another X-band radio that's on the rover, which could actually transmit data up to the orbiters at 128 kilobits a second. That's because it's not so far away, it's a few hundred miles. So they reprogrammed the rovers and the orbiters. So the rovers would gather their data, they'd wait till the orbiter came overhead, and they'd squirt the data up to the orbiter, and the orbiter would hang on to the data until it got to the right place in its orbit to transmit data back to the Deep Space Network at 128 kilobits a second, because the orbiter is outside of the atmosphere of Mars and it had bigger solar panels. So all the data that was coming back from Mars came back through this store and forward network. Well, store and forward is called packet switching, and packet switching is the way the internet works. So this was a worked example for the scientists to see that even a little 2-hop network was very valuable to them. And the same thing happened when the Phoenix lander arrived on Mars in May of 2008 at the North Pole. That configuration didn't have a direct-to-Earth path at all, and so they designed it to go store and forward through the orbiters. So my colleagues and I, way back starting in '98, said, okay, so how do we design this interplanetary internet? And we started out thinking we could use the TCP/IP protocols, so they seem to work okay on Earth, so they ought to work okay on Mars. And in fact, they will work okay on Mars, and they will work in the spacecraft. The only problem is they won't work between the planets. And the problem there is that the speed of light is too slow. If you do the math, even when Earth and Mars are closest together in their orbits, they're 35 million miles apart. It takes 3.5 minutes one way for a radio signal to go from Earth to Mars, and of course 7 minutes round trip. When we're farthest apart, we're 235 million miles apart, and that's 20 minutes one way, 40 minutes round trip time. Now, can you imagine, trying to do a website where you click on the mouse and it takes 40 minutes for the first bit to come back? And I know probably some of you have networks that do that today, but it's not because of the speed of light problem. So we have to do something to design the protocols to overcome speed of light delay, because TCP/IP doesn't work that very well that way. There's another problem, and it's called celestial motion. Now, the planets are rotating, and we haven't figured out how to stop that. So the problem is that if you're on the surface of the planet and you're trying to talk and the planet rotates, eventually you can't talk anymore because the planet is in between you and the other side. So you have to wait until it comes back around again. So this is very disruptive. And the net result is you have a variably delayed, disrupted environment in which to communicate, and the TCP/IP protocols are not well suited to that. So we had to design a whole new suite of protocols we call the bundle protocols. They've been tested in space. We have them running on the International Space Station. They've been tested on the ground by the military in tactical military maneuvers. We had the Sami, the reindeer herders in northern Sweden, testing the protocols in the remote villages in the northern part of Sweden. We put the protocols on board the epoxy spacecraft, which just rendezvoused with the comet Hartley 2 in November of last year, and we were testing this at 81 light seconds away. All of it worked very well, so we're at the point now where we're standardizing these protocols through the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems. And what we hope is that if they're adopted as standards, then every spacefaring nation has the option of building their spacecraft to meet those standard protocols. The side effect of that is just like the internet. What happens is that as you build these spacecraft and possibly repurpose them to become communication nodes in a backbone, that will literally grow a backbone network because they all have common protocols that will work in store and forward fashion. Just like when you plug into the internet, you can talk to those 800 million different machines because they all use the same standards. So that's where we are with the interplanetary internet. It's been very successful so far, and I hope before the end of this decade that we'll actually begin to see parts of an interplanetary system growing. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I will take questions now as time permits.